The 100-year-old floorboards of the Carson mill didn't just creak. They groaned under the weight of a silence that had turned the entire town of Willard into strangers. Emily stood frozen as the heavy metal grate of the local grocer's shop slammed shut with a final, echoed crash. The man she'd known for 20 years refusing to meet her eyes. In the suffocating Kansas heat, the air felt brittle, like a secret about to snap. When the black SUV skidded to a halt in her gravel driveway, the dust hadn't even settled before 3 men in charcoal suits stepped out, brandishing a folder with a red official seal that looked like a fresh wound. "We can have this place padlocked by sunset," the lead inspector muttered, his eyes roving over the ancient wooden rafters as if documenting a crime scene. As he unspooled a roll of neon yellow warning tape across her front door, Emily realized the rules of her world had changed overnight. The people she called neighbors were retreating into the shadows. And the sheriff, a man who had carried her father's casket, was now turning his back while her heritage was marked for destruction. She wasn't just losing her business. She was standing in the center of a trap that had been decades in the making. And the first match was already being struck. The sack of flour split at the seam when Emmy hoisted it onto her shoulder, a fine white dust exploding into the air like a sigh. She coughed, the grit coating her throat, and wiped her sleeve across her mouth, only to smear flour into the cracks of her chapped lips. The mill's floorboards groaned underfoot, warped by decades of spilled grain and sweat, each step sending up puffs of stale chaff that clung to her ankles. Outside, the heat pressed against the warped planks of the mill like a living thing, seeping through the gaps. Emmy adjusted the strap of her apron, the rough cotton abrading the sunburn peeling along her collarbone. A fly buzzed lazy circles around her face, its wings a dull hum against the rhythmic thunk-thunk of the millstones grinding wheat into powder. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand, stinging her eyes with salt. The 100-year-old wooden beams above her head seemed to moan under the weight of the stagnant, scorched air. Dust motes danced in the golden shafts of light, piercing through the wall slats, turning the atmosphere into a suffocating haze. The stones turned with a labored screech, as if time itself resisted the abnormal Kansas heat. Emmy pressed her palm against the vibrating timber of the main support wall, feeling the old wood pulse with a deep, internal tension. It was the hum of a machine pushed to its limit, or perhaps a warning of the storm that refused to break over the parched, yellowed fields of Willard. "You're going to wear a hole in that floor if you keep pacing," came a voice from the shadows near the grain bins. Old Man Hargrove leaned against the wall, his suspenders sagging, a chaw of tobacco bulging in his cheek. He spat into a tin can with practiced aim. "Storm's coming. Can smell it." Emmy didn't answer. She knew the scent, ozone sharp beneath the sour tang of fermenting grain, the way the air thickened like syrup before a downpour. But the sky stayed a relentless, bleached blue. She left the mill, stepping out into the blinding glare of the afternoon. The heat from the cobblestones of the town square radiated through the soles of her boots. Usually, this place smelled of fresh yeast and the comfortable hum of gossip. But today, the air felt thin, brittle. She saw old Arthur and Mrs. Green sitting on their usual bench, their voices low and urgent. As soon as Emmy's shadow stretched across the pavement toward them, the conversation died. Arthur snapped his newspaper shut against his knee, suddenly fascinated by the scuffed toes of his shoes. Mrs. Green tugged at the brim of her hat, tracing the cracks in the sidewalk with a frantic intensity, as if searching for a lost prayer. The laughter near the central fountain evaporated, replaced by the dry rattle of dead leaves skittering across the bricks. Emmy caught the eye of the local grocer, but he ducked behind his counter, the heavy metal grate of his shop window sliding down with a final, echoing crash. Willard was closing its doors to her. She felt the isolation like a physical weight as she walked toward the town hall. Inside the council chambers, the air conditioning hummed, but it didn't cut the heat of the tension. Tom Watkins sat at the head of the long oak table, his tie loosened and the top button of his shirt missing, revealing a neck flushed a deep, angry red. He didn't look up when Emmy entered. He slammed his gavel down, the sound ricocheting off the high ceilings like a gunshot. "Order," Watkins barked, though the room was already deathly silent. He spread a scroll with a heavy wax seal across the podium, the paper crackling in his trembling fingers. The other council members sat like statues, their faces gray masks in the flickering fluorescent light. Watkins began to read, his voice booming as he detailed the immediate rezoning of the valley lands. Every word fell like a stone into a deep well. Ripples of bureaucratic jargon, systematically erasing property rights held for generations. He didn't lift his eyes from the text, his pen moving in steady, sharp strokes that felt like incisions. Emmy left the hall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She barely reached her truck before a black SUV tore up the gravel path, skidding to a halt just inches from her mill's porch. 3 men in stiff, charcoal gray suits stepped out. They didn't wait for an invitation. The lead inspector slapped his hand against the doorframe, leaving a dusty palm print on the fresh white paint Emmy had applied only a month ago. "Stay back, Miss Carson," the inspector said, thrusting a leather portfolio toward her face, the metal buckles glinting. They shouldered past her, their heavy boots thumping rhythmically on the clean floorboards. Their eyes roved over the rafters and the grinding gears, recording every scratch and oil stain as if they were documenting a crime scene. The lead man ripped a sheet from his clipboard and held it out with a cold, narrow-eyed squint. At the bottom, a red official seal glowed like a fresh wound against the white dust of the mill. "Technical regulations," the man muttered, pointing to a paragraph about shaft curvature and lubricant viscosity. The letters blurred before Emmy's eyes. "We can have this place padlocked by sunset if the specs aren't met." Emmy's fingers curled into fists, the official notice crumpling in her grip. The inspector was already walking toward the main power grid, unspooling a roll of bright yellow warning tape. She couldn't breathe. She turned and ran toward the fields, needing to find a friendly face, someone to stand with her. She found Miller, her father's oldest friend, out by his tractor. He wouldn't look at her. He kept his head down, wrenching at a rusted bolt until his knuckles bled. When she spoke of a collective protest, he jerked the tool so hard it clattered to the dirt. Nearby, the Browns saw her coming and retreated into their barn, the heavy doors groaning shut. The silence of the fields was louder than the mill. Fear of Watkins had proven sturdier than decades of neighborly bonds. Driven by a desperation that felt like fire in her veins, Emmy waited for the sun to drop. She returned to the town center, pressing her back against the cool, damp stone of the municipal archives. The crickets chirped a frantic rhythm in the tall grass. She pulled a set of old picks from her pocket, tools she'd used 1,000 times to fix the mill's stubborn locks. The side door of the archive building gave way with a soft, metallic click. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mold and decomposing paper. The beam of her flashlight trembled, dancing across rows of heavy, buckram-bound folders. She moved on her tiptoes, avoiding the chairs that shrieked at the slightest touch. When she found the shelf labeled Zoning Ward Jurisvarings, she pulled the heavy folder. A cloud of ancient dust erupted, and she had to clamp her hand over her mouth to keep from coughing and alerting the night watchman. She spread the documents on the floor, the light of her torch illuminating the dense, legalistic print. There, buried in the footnotes, was the name: Agro Global Limited. Her fingers shook as she compared the new exclusion zones with the boundaries of the independent farms. It was a map of a massacre. The hidden clauses dictated a transfer of management rights to the corporation at the first sign of a regulatory violation. The ink on the signatures looked fresh, almost oily. Emmy sat on the floor, the scale of the betrayal turning her stomach. Watkins hadn't just made a mistake. He was a surveyor for a corporate invasion. The mill, her home, the land. It was all just the first row of dominoes. She snapped photos of the pages, the click of the shutter sounding like a guillotine. The next morning, the doors of the mayor's office flew open. Emmy marched in, throwing the pile of printed photos onto the polished wood of the conference table. The sheets slid across the surface, fanning out before Tom Watkins. "I found the Ag Global contracts, Tom," she said, her voice ringing out, sharp enough to cut through the murmurs of the gathered clerks. "I found the kickback schedules." Watkins paled, his fingers reflexively clawing at the documents. Emmy pointed to the clauses on forced bankruptcy, her eyes locked onto his. The room fell into a jagged silence, broken only by the sound of Watkins's chair creaking as he shifted under the weight of 100 questioning stares. He slowly stood up, leaning his weight onto his white-knuckled fists. A predatory smirk curled his lip, and he lowered his voice to a whisper that made the hair on Emmy's neck stand up. "By morning, Miss Carson," he hissed, "there won't be enough of your reputation left to bury. This mill will drown in audits and criminal filings. I will crush you like a fly on a windshield." Emmy didn't blink. She turned and walked out, returning to the mill as the first rays of dawn painted the sky in a bruised, sickly purple. The old building looked fragile now, a wooden skeleton waiting for the storm. She ran her hand over the rough bark of the oak tree in the yard, knowing that Watkins's traps were already being set. By noon, the town square was a different kind of battlefield. Emmy stood on the edge of the stone fountain, her voice cracking as she tried to rally the passing farmers. "Look at the logos on those envelopes," she shouted, pointing to the gold-embossed packets Mark and Sam were holding. Mark's shoulders hunched, his fingers crushing the paper from Agro Global. Sam spat on the dry earth and turned his back to her, intently studying the window of the pharmacy. The heavy seals on their documents glinted in the sun like armor. When Emmy stepped toward them, they retreated in unison, leaving a void around her that smelled only of hot asphalt and dust. Suddenly, the metallic crackle of the town's PA system tore through the air. Watkins' voice, amplified and smooth, filled every corner of the square. "Due to the new partnership," Watkins announced, his tone savoring every syllable, "all outstanding land debts for participating members are hereby forgiven in full." Emmy watched the tension drain out of the men's faces. It was replaced by a shameful, quiet relief. The crowd began to flow around her, treating her like a pylon in a river. She was left standing in the center of the square, a ghost in her own town. The sound of a patrol car's tires on gravel signaled the next blow. Sheriff Miller stepped out of the vehicle, the door closing with a heavy, final thud. He adjusted his gun belt, looking at the crows circling the mill's roof rather than at Emmy. She blocked the path to her office, her heart sinking at the sight of the badge on his chest. A badge her father had helped him earn. "I have a warrant, Emmy," Miller said, his voice flat. He thrust a crisp sheet of paper toward her, refusing to meet her eyes. His leather clipboard smelled of fresh oil. She saw his fingers twitching as he read the order for the immediate seizure of all business ledgers and tax records. "You can't do this, Jim," she whispered. But he was already moving. She lunged for the heavy leather ledger on her desk, but Miller's hand came down over hers. His grip was like a lead weight. He didn't look at her as he firmly nudged her aside with his shoulder, clearing the way for his deputies. Box after box of her family's history was hauled out and thudded into the back of the patrol car. The sound of the trunk slamming shut resonated in her ears like a heartbeat, leaving the office feeling hollowed out, robbed. Then came the chains. Heavy steel links were snaked through the handles of the mill's main gates. Emmy watched as the padlock clicked shut. The workers in blue coveralls, men she'd shared coffee with for years, kept their heads down, hiding their faces under the brims of their caps. One man dropped a sack of grain, the kernels spilling like teeth across the dirt. But he didn't stop to clean it. He hurried to his truck, terrified that the shadow of the police lights might stain him too. The mill was silent. The workers were gone. Emmy stood at the gate, her fingers white as she gripped the cold iron links. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in her kitchen, watching the darkness, until a sharp, acrid scent reached her. Smoke. She bolted to the window. The sky over Willard was a bruised, toxic orange. The grain warehouse at the edge of her property was a wall of fire, the seasoned wood screaming as the flames licked the rafters. Sparks spiraled into the blackness, mimicking the stars. She pressed her hand to the glass. It was already hot to the touch. Down by the tree line, she caught a flicker of movement. Two dark shapes slipping into the brush, disappearing before she could find her voice to scream. She ran for the well, the water splashing over her boots in the frantic race to the fire. The buckets felt like they were filled with lead, the handles cutting into her palms. The heat was a physical blow, shrinking the skin on her face and filling her lungs with the taste of scorched oats. She flung the water into the heart of the blaze, but it only hissed, a pathetic sound against the roar of the destruction. She stood alone against the inferno, a small, desperate figure silhouetted by the death of her livelihood, while the scent of gasoline lingered in the air like a taunt. Desperation birthed a cold, hard clarity. The next evening, Emmy slipped through the back door of Joe's Diner. The air inside was thick with the smell of old grease and cheap chicory. She dropped to her knees, hidden by the high-backed red vinyl booths, and crawled toward the far corner. Her fingers trembled as she reached under the table of the back booth, pressing a tiny digital recorder against the underside of the wood and securing it with a strip of duct tape. Her heart thundered so loudly, she was sure the empty room could hear it. She scrambled back into the kitchen corridor just as the front door creaked open. She huddled in the shadows of the alleyway, her back against the damp brick. Through the smeared glass of the diner window, she watched Watkins enter. He adjusted his coat and slid into the bugged booth. Sheriff Miller joined him, placing his Stetson on the table with a slow, weary motion. Watkins leaned forward, his face twisting into a sharp, predatory grin as his lips moved in a rapid, hushed cadence. Miller just nodded, stirring sugar into his coffee with a rhythmic, clinking sound. Watkins slid a thick white envelope across the table. Later, in the safety of her lightless cellar, Emmy hit play. The recording hissed. Then Watkins' voice filled the space, stripped of its public charm. "The medical records are being drafted now," Watkins said, his voice oily. "We'll cite the mother's history. Psychological instability. Hereditary delusions. Once the doc signs off on the commitment papers, the mill falls to the state, and the state sells to Ag Global. Clean and simple." Emmy sat on a crate, the coldness of the basement seeping into her bones. He was going after her mind. He was using her mother's tragedy, the one secret she'd spent her life protecting, as a crowbar to pry her life apart. The cruelty of it was a physical blow. By the end of the week, the town wouldn't just think she was a troublemaker, they'd think she was a madwoman. The next morning brought the final hammer blow. A courier on a moped skidded into her yard, tossing a packet onto the porch without even killing the engine. Emmy tore it open. Annulled was stamped in bold red across her bank statement. The credit line she used to buy seed and pay taxes had been wiped out. The bank demanded the full balance, $40,000, by noon. She looked at the clock. It was 9. She drove to the bank, her hands shaking on the wheel. But when she burst into the manager's office, it wasn't the manager waiting for her. Watkins was there, slowly stirring a cup of coffee. The smell of caramel was cloying, nauseating. He pushed a gold-embossed sheet of paper toward the edge of the desk. "Sign the voluntary forfeiture, Emmy," he said, his eyes gleaming behind his spectacles. "Save yourself the public embarrassment of a sanity hearing." Emmy didn't sign. She drove to Miller's house, finding him on the porch with open suitcases. He was packing his life into the back of a car, his uniform shirts crumpled and stained. When she grabbed his arm, he wrenched away, his face a deep, shameful crimson. "They cleared my mortgage, Emmy," he muttered, throwing a bundle of clothes into a trunk. "A 5-figure check. I'm done. I'm out." He wouldn't look at her. He clicked the locks on his luggage and turned his back, leaving her standing on a porch that smelled of old leather and cowardice. As she drove back toward the mill, a massive Ag Global grain truck rumbled toward her. Gary, a neighbor who'd helped her fix her roof last spring, was behind the wheel. She stood in the middle of the road, arms outstretched. But Gary didn't slow down. The radiator grill roared inches from her chest, the heat of the engine blasting her face. He leaned out the window and screamed, "Get out of the way, you crazy bitch! You're costing us our bonuses!" She dived into the ditch as the multi-ton machine thundered past, leaving her in a choking cloud of dust and diesel. She retreated to her office, reaching for the phone to call a lawyer in the city. But the line was dead. She traced the cord to the wall. It had been severed, the copper wires glinting like cut nerves. She ran to the door, but it was blocked. Fresh pine boards had been nailed across the frame from the outside, the blue seal of the Willard City Council stamped on the wood. The scent of fresh sap mixed with the smell of old flour. She hammered her fists against the boards until her knuckles bled. But the mill had become her prison. Eventually, she managed to pry a slat from the back window and slipped out, making her way toward the county fairgrounds. It was the final night of the fair, the one time the whole town gathered. The air was thick with the smell of fried dough and the screams of children on the tilt-a-whirl. But as Emmy walked through the gates, the festive atmosphere curdled. A group of women near the bakery stall fell silent, their eyes following her like lead weights. Someone shouted a slur. A man on a bench spat on the ground as she passed. The townspeople she'd known since she was a girl looked at her as if she were a carrier of a plague. 3 farmers, their breath stinking of cheap whiskey, blocked her path near the livestock pens. One shoved her, and she stumbled, her knees hitting the sticky gray mud of the fairgrounds. "Just sign the papers, Carson," the man growled, looming over her. "Stop making this hard on everyone." Emmy scrambled up, wiping the filth from her chin. She looked toward the main stage, where Watkins was adjusting a microphone under a canopy of red, white, and blue bunting. He was smiling, his silk tie shimmering in the sun. He tapped the mic, thump, thump, the sound echoing across the valley. She made a break for the stage, but 2 of Watkins' hired security guards caught her. They lifted her off her feet, dragging her into the shadows between the food trailers. The smell of burnt grease and wet cardboard was overwhelming. They pinned her against the corrugated metal of a truck, their bodies forming a wall. "Stay put," one hissed. On stage, Watkins began to speak. He held up a gold pen, the nib catching the light like a scepter. The crowd cheered, a roar of desperate, bought-out hope. Emmy saw the pen descend toward the contract that would finalize the sale of the town's soul. In the distance, a line of black SUVs belonging to the Ag Global executives began to wind up the hill toward her mill. She had 5 minutes. Emmy didn't fight the guards. She went limp, and as they relaxed their grip, she dropped to the ground, sliding between their legs and scrambling under the chassis of a nearby equipment truck. The smell of old oil and crushed grass filled her nose. She crawled on her elbows, the gravel tearing at her skin, until she reached the gray steel housing of the fair's main electrical and audio hub. She found the radio system's input, hidden under a layer of dust. With trembling hands, she pulled the recorder from her pocket and jammed the jack into the amplifier's auxiliary port. The small screen glowed a faint, ghostly green. She hit play and cranked the master volume to the red line. A screech of feedback tore through the air, silencing Watkins mid-sentence. Then his voice, cold, arrogant, and clear, erupted from the massive speaker stacks. Just a herd of stupid sheep. The recorded Watkins said, the sound vibrating the windows of the nearby trailers. Willard is a pile of manure we're going to flip for a profit. They'll thank me for the pittance we leave them. The fairgrounds went deathly still. Emmy watched through the truck's wheels as the hand of a farmer, raised to point at her, slowly lowered. Watkins's voice continued, detailing the bribes, the fake medical reports, the contempt he held for every man and woman in the square. On stage, Watkins turned the color of ash. He lunged for the microphone, trying to scream over the recording, but the sound of his own recorded laughter drowned him out. He began to beat the podium with his fists, but the speakers kept chanting his crimes. The silence of the crowd broke. It didn't break into a cheer, it broke into a roar of primal fury. Mark, the farmer who had shoved Emmy earlier, was the first to reach the stage. He tore through the plastic barricades like they were paper. The wave of people followed, a sea of work shirts and sun-reddened faces. Watkins tried to bolt for the back stairs, clutching the leather folder to his chest. Emmy emerged from under the truck, intercepting him at the base of the wooden steps. He skidded to a halt, his eyes wide with a frantic, animal terror. "Give it to me, Tom," she said, her voice steady. He tried to push past her, but she held her ground. The first of the farmers reached the stage above them, the wood groaning under their weight. Emmy lunged, her fingers catching the edge of the blue folder. They grappled, the paper tearing, until a massive hand, Mark's hand, grabbed Watkins by the collar and yanked him backward. The folder fell. Emmy caught it, pressing the original, unsigned contract to her chest. The black SUVs at the gate didn't wait. Seeing the riot, they spun their tires, kicking up clouds of dirt and gravel as they fled the scene. The corporate lawyers were gone before Watkins even hit the ground. In the aftermath, the fairgrounds felt like a graveyard. Sheriff Miller stood by the stage, his star glinting mockingly in the setting sun. He slowly unpinned it, his shoulders sagging, and placed the metal badge on a discarded table. He didn't look at Emmy as he walked away into the shadows. Emmy walked back to her mill. She tore the yellow tape from the doors, the plastic snapping with a satisfying crack. She threw open the heavy oak stubs, letting the scent of grain and old wood wash over her. But as she looked back toward the town, she saw the farmers standing in small, fractured groups. They weren't celebrating. They were arguing, accusing each other of being the first to take the money, the first to turn their backs. The trust that had held Willard together for a century hadn't just been bent. It had been pulverized. She sat on her porch, the wood still warm from the day's heat. She had saved the land. She had saved the building. But as the lights of the town flickered and dimmed, she realized the Willard she knew was gone. She was the victor of a ghost town, sitting alone on the threshold of a heritage that no longer had a home. The mill was standing, but the heart of the valley was silent.